Swiss cheese and predatory business practices. I've spoken about these before in several other videos. What is this Swiss cheese? Well, the short version is that a bad incident can really only occur if something falls through one of the holes in a slice of Swiss cheese. The more slices you add, the more barriers exist to prevent an incident from occurring. But another point of view with this model is that every time a pilot or the medical crew falls through one slice of the cheese, this should be a loud voice screaming at them to turn around or stop or go home or land. But sometimes people just do not see that they have fallen through one slice, and then another, and then another, and then another, until it's too late and something terrible occurs. But even worse though is, what if a flight crew was falling through one of the holes in one of these slices and upper management saw it happening and did nothing about it? If ever there was a case where the crew just continued to fall through slice after slice after slice, and maybe even pushed a little, it was the crew of TriState CareFlight 5 on July 17, 2014. The full story coming up on this episode of the Dr. Medic. The operator in this incident was the original TriState CareFlight, which provided air medical coverage all across Arizona, New Mexico, Nevada, and Colorado, and would also take flights into many of the neighboring states. TriState was originally founded in 2002, and at the time of this accident had an amazing fleet with nearly 30 aircraft made up mostly of Augusta 109s and 119s, but also some A-Star 350s and some King Air 200 fixed wings. And by the time this incident occurred, TriState had already been accredited by CAMES for about 8 years, gaining their initial accreditation back in April of 2006. The aircraft was this Augusta Westland AW109E, otherwise known as a 109 Power, with tail number November 507 Charlie Foxtrot. Originally manufactured in 2000, this 109 had two Pratt & Whitney Canada PW206C turboshaft engines, each making 549 horsepower. This aircraft was certified for instrument flight and passed its last inspection on the 4th of July 2014. The avionics did include a Garmin 530 GPS and a side panel mounted Garmin GPS Map 396. The cockpit was modified for NVGs and also included an enhanced ground proximity warning system and a radar altimeter, but I did not find any evidence that this helicopter had a terrain awareness warning system, otherwise known as TAWS, even though TAWS training was a part of the company training. Now, even though this base was pretty remote with the closest Doppler nearly 45 miles away, the weather forecasts for this night were pretty consistent that there were forecasts for damaging thunderstorms with winds or gusts near 50 knots all the way through 0600 the following day, including the increased risk for wind shear, strong updrafts, strong downdrafts, reduced ceilings, and reduced visibility. The air map for the accident and valid for the accident site forecasted instrument conditions with ceilings below 1,000 feet and visibility below 3 miles. In other words, all forecasts predicted crappy weather. And not only crappy weather, but damaging thunderstorms. And even without the weather forecast, the helicopter would have been operating in an area that was very well known by company pilots to have the potential for low visibility. Now, due to the low-level cloud cover, there was not much natural or artificial light to aid in their navigation with the night vision goggles. TriState did have NVGs and used the third generation of Anvis 9 goggles. And according to company policy at the time, the pilot and one additional crew member were supposed to be wearing their night vision goggles during all nighttime operations. Now, the pilot in this incident was 46-year-old David Kavanaugh. Pilot David held a commercial pilot certificate for helicopter as well as an instrument helicopter and was also a flight instructor. He had a second-class medical with his only limitation being corrective lenses. Now, David had been working at TriState for almost 5 years, being hired in September of 2009. Now, he first got started in the Augusto 119s, which are just a slightly smaller single-engine version of the 109s with skids instead of landing gear. Then he started flying in the AS350s before finally getting time in the 109 Powers. Pilot David was very experienced with 6,167 total hours, with 208 hours in the 109 and 410 hours at night. And while Pilot David did hold a commercial certificate for instruments and helicopters, he had a grand total of 0 actual instrument hours in a helicopter. On July 17, 2014 at 0018, or just 18 minutes past midnight, someone at Trigg Memorial Hospital in Tucumcari, New Mexico, which is in the southwestern part of the United States, calls TriState CareFlight's dispatch center and requests a helicopter to fly to their facility to pick up a patient and transfer them to a hospital in the big city of Albuquerque, New Mexico. The dispatch center first calls up TriState CareFlight 21, which is actually based right there in Tucumcari. Well, why didn't the helicopter that was based right there in the same city take the patient? They didn't take the patient because just a bit earlier in the night, they were stuck in Amarillo, Texas because they were trying to return to their base in Tucumcari and got closed in by thunderstorms and then were forced to land in a field. So they declined the flight. So instead of telling the hospital that TriState could not accept the flight, the dispatcher then calls TriState CareFlight Base 23, which is based in Roswell, New Mexico. CareFlight 23 also turns down the flight due to thunderstorms between their location and Tucumcari. Finally, 24 minutes after first dispatching Base 21, the TriState dispatcher calls CareFlight 5, which is the accident helicopter in this case, who is based all the way in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and speaks with Pilot David. But they do not inform Pilot David that the other 2 CareFlight crews have declined the flight, nor do they tell him about the weather concerns from the other crews. Pilot David takes less than 20 seconds to accept the flight, and 8 minutes later he radios dispatch to tell them that they are en route, and that is the last time anyone ever heard from Pilot David. The crew leaves their Santa Fe base on a heading of about 100 degrees and flying about 3,800 feet above the ground with a ground speed of about 160 knots. The 109 Power is fast. They basically fly around the edge of the southern Rocky Mountains without issue for nearly 40 minutes. Remember, they are the third choice to pick up this patient, so they are pretty far away. But at about 0121, the helicopter begins a slight descending turn, which historically means one of 2 things. They are either going to slowly descend into the ground because the pilot is spatially disoriented, or they are going to successfully turn around and go home. But neither of those things occur, and instead, the helicopter makes a full 360-degree turn, getting as low as 1,200 feet above the ground before resuming the same course to Tucumcari. The helicopter then flew straight again for nearly 15 minutes before making a pretty abrupt right-hand turn and stayed on a new heading of south-southeast, where it now maintained this course for nearly 5 minutes, as Pilot David most likely made this course correction to head south to pick up Interstate 40, which was well known to the company pilots as a resource, as they could follow that interstate east straight into Tucumcari. But just 4 minutes later, the helicopter started a further right-hand turn and was now facing south-southwest and climbing heavily. The helicopter then turned sharply to the left and began to descend at about 940 feet per minute. This final left-hand turn continued for nearly another full 360 degrees that continued to tighten and continued to descend until at 0141, the helicopter impacted the side of a 150-foot tall mesa, completely destroying the aircraft and engulfing the fuselage in fire. Now, following the accident, the TriState Dispatch Center attempted to reach the CareFlight crew for nearly 17 or 18 minutes. When these attempts were unsuccessful, they dispatched 3 of their own medical helicopters to search for the crew at their last known position. Now, one of the pilots searching was able to get close to the site but was unable to find anything, but the other 2 pilots were not even able to make it to the scene due to the low cloud cover and poor visibility. It was not for another hour and a half that a local ranch hand spotted spotted a fire on a local property and went to investigate. And then it was not until almost 0400 that morning that the New Mexico State Police confirmed that the wreckage of the helicopter had been found. Pilot David Kavanaugh, 46, of Rio Rancho, flight nurse James Butler, 46, of Albuquerque, and flight paramedic Rebecca Surkey, just 29 years old, out of Rio Rancho, all died in this accident. Well, I'm just going to jump right to the NTSB's probable cause, which stated that the cause of this accident was the pilot's inadvertent visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions, which resulted in a loss of helicopter control. Well, included in the NTSB's mission statement is that they are to conduct objective, thorough investigations. Now, if you have watched this channel long enough, you know that the thorough part of that statement sometimes leaves much to be desired, and I do not think this incident is any different. You see, during the NTSB's investigation, they quickly discovered that this pilot was the third pilot called for this particular patient transfer, with the first two declining the flight due to weather. The NTSB knew that the dispatcher did not inform Pilot David that these two other pilots declined the flights, yet the NTSB did not make this a focus of their investigation at all. So, why did those dispatchers not inform the pilot? Well, I have received information from multiple sources, which include multiple TriState employees who were employed at the time of this accident, all of whom chose to speak on condition of anonymity, claiming that even though TriState did have an operational control center, that the dispatchers were strictly prohibited from telling the pilots if other bases or services had turned down flights, and were not even allowed to discuss the weather with the pilots at all. And even though TriState had a recorded phone system for complaints and official communication, that TriState managers would contact pilots by private cell phone if they did turn down flights to badger them about refusing the flights. And even if they had the balls to refuse a flight in the first place, that more than one pilot had been fired or disciplined for turning down flights in the past. Now, I have discussed helicopter shopping in more than one episode, and by all means, I fully understand that just like most things in life, that the definition of helicopter shopping exists on some form of spectrum. I mean, on one end of the spectrum, if a dispatcher calls some base and the pilot cannot accept the flight because of a wall of thunderstorms in front of them, I see no problem with asking another base, who may be on the other side of the storm, to see if it's feasible for them to get safely to the patient, transport them, and make it home, so long as the other base is fully informed of the situation, to include the other pilots that might have turned down the flight. But in the other end of the spectrum, this TriState version of the helicopter shopping, in my opinion, is downright criminal. To purposely go out of your way to withhold information from a pilot in these types of cases is absolutely egregious, and people should be held accountable for it. But as of now, they never have been, at any agency, ever. Why? For one, the NTSB doesn't care. While every now and then you do see the NTSB proceed with an extremely in-depth and complicated investigation that includes the culture and work environment, such as they did with the survival flight case in Ohio, but more times than not, you get a case like this, where the investigators completely ignore the toxic culture, the lack of training and education, and the predatory business practices that led a perfectly competent and experienced pilot to make a terrible decision in accepting the flight, to which he then continued to bury himself even deeper by not turning around earlier or simply landing the aircraft at the first safe opportunity. And two, the NTSB's findings are never legally binding in any sort of way other than to rack up data that they can then use to recommend safety updates to the FAA, who most of the time will simply ignore them anyway. And three, due to the archaic workers' compensation laws in most states, almost all of the victims of these accidents, if they were crew members and not a patient, are completely unable to seek legal and financial compensation from these operators, as these cases continuously get dismissed from civil courts, almost always with prejudice, and sent back to workers' comp courts. But maybe that's just me. I'm curious what you think. If a private for-profit company operating under Part 135 will stop at nothing to accept as many flights as possible, even going so far as to purposely withhold information from a pilot, such as whether or not any other pilots turned down a flight, and then that pilot subsequently flies the aircraft into the side of a mesa in the middle of nowhere, killing everyone on board, should they be able to be sued by the families families of the fallen victims? Should the managers and executives who created the culture that allows and encourages such practices to occur in the first place be charged criminally? You tell me. Let me know in the comments below. Or, in cases like this, is crashing and dying in the helicopter just a hazard of the job? Because that is exactly what United States District Judge Martha Vasquez thinks. Now, according to Judge Vasquez, and using the flawed case law from the famous Delgado case, the only way that the actions of TriState could have been egregious enough to satisfy the Delgado elements is if they were literally watching the helicopter flying into the side of a mountain and purposely chose to not tell the pilot the mountain was there in the first place. Well, in my opinion, withholding the information from this pilot about the weather and the 2 previous turndowns is no different. But Judge Vasquez and many other judges in cases just like this across the country feel that because TriState managers did not actually call up Pilot David and force him to take this flight, that the level of egregiousness just wasn't enough to move the case from workers' comp court to civil court, and therefore the case was dismissed. So, while I agree that Pilot David made some terrible decisions and that he should have been competent enough to declare an emergency after entering instrument conditions, I offer up my amended probable cause of this accident to be as follows. This incident occurred due to the pilot's inadvertent visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions, which resulted in a loss of helicopter control. But contributing to the pilot's inadvertent visual flight into instrument meteorological conditions were the predatory and possibly criminal business tactics used by upper management of TriState CareFlight, which included fostering a culture that pressured pilots into taking flights that were otherwise unsafe, retaliating against pilots who did turn down flights, and withholding vital safety and weather information from pilots when providing dispatch information for flight requests. Now, it is worth pointing out that this was not TriState's first crash, as they had another one in 2005 where full loss of engine power in their single engine Augusta 119 caused the aircraft to fall out of the sky while on final approach to a landing zone, killing all 3 members on board. Now, at the time of this incident in 2014, though, TriState CareFlight was privately owned and operated, but just a bit over a year after the crash, they were purchased by Air Methods for a whopping $222 million, and they have continued to operate as a wholly owned subsidiary of Air Methods ever since. While the NTSB's report routinely uses the word accident, you'll note that I will only refer to this as an incident. Why? Because accidents imply that there was some unknown that occurred and that there was nothing that could have been done to prevent the crash. But that's not the case here at all. This incident was 100% preventable. It could have been prevented by fostering a safety culture that allowed pilots to turn down flights without the fear of retaliation. It could have been prevented by not even calling Pilot David in the first place, knowing that 2 other pilots had already turned it down. It could have been prevented by informing Pilot David of the weather conditions in the previous turndowns. It also could have been prevented on Pilot David's end by turning around earlier or landing in a field or following his inadvertent IMC procedures. But it also could have been prevented by calling a qualified critical care ground crew to transport this patient instead. Now, one positive from this tragedy is that the friends and family of flight paramedic Rebecca Surkey created the Rebecca Surkey Follow Your Dreams Foundation to raise scholarship funds in Rebecca's name to help others achieve their dreams of becoming a paramedic. I've included a link to Rebecca's foundation in the description below. Thank you for taking the time to watch and listen to this story, and as always, these stories exist on this channel so that we can learn from them and prevent the same mistakes from occurring in the future. And while it is important to learn from these stories, I have to say that it is also important for victims to be able to have legal recourse to hold those accountable for fostering this type of environment in the first place. Unfortunately, there will probably be another episode in the future. I hope to see you there. Cheers.